Welcome, and thank you for joining me in these few moments of reflection. These reflections are really put together for the members of the Pentecost Vision, the Vision movement, but they will of course share them with anyone they wish. This year, for your theme for presentation for the work you're doing together, is courage, Mut. And as you are working together to prepare the program you will present at the great feast of Pentecost later in the year, you must be discussing and thinking over the word courage and where you have experienced it and what it really means, what it means to you. I just want to add perhaps a few thoughts that you may have touched on already, so that you can widen and deepen the discussions you may be having. I think that when the word courage is used, we mostly think of endurance and risk. Mainly the endurance of pain and suffering. Physical pain, physical suffering, and we think of our heroes or our martyrs. But there's also the endurance that leads to the willingness to risk. To risk ridicule, being made fun of, failing, being misunderstood, being disappointed. So what really is the source of this courage that makes us able to endure pain and suffering to an intensity and a higher degree than most people do, or in our ordinary lives? Or willingness to set everything aside and risk the failure, the misunderstanding of others. What is the source of this courage? It doesn't belong to just generals in the army who are heroes in the battle. It doesn't just belong to the canonized saints who gave their lives for their religious convictions. Anyone can experience courage, endurance, take risks. It's as much the privilege and the quality of being a housewife or a politician or a scientist or an artist. Anyone. You, me. Is that really the source of courage? Is it perhaps that we're willing to endure and to risk because we have a passion for the truth, the ideals we hold, that they matter more to us than anything else or anyone else, that we'd give even our lives for that truth? Is that the source? A passion for truth, for justice, for peace. That's mostly how we see courage expressed. Not only does it belong to anyone and everyone, whatever lifestyle or place they live, it's any age. We've just had a young girl who's then a teenager given the great international honor of the Peace Nobel Prize as a young girl who worked for social justice. So, courage, endurance, the capacity to risk is something that belongs to all of us. What is its source? Just this passion for something else? When we think over the times when we've seen courage expressed by other people, have we got closer to the understanding of where it comes from. What is its source? I'm going to share two reflections and the experiences I had, which made it clear to me. So you're going to have to use your imagination, unless you're one of the few people I know who might have been in this physical environment that I'm going to describe. But it's not hard to imagine. It's a situation in North India, a rural situation, where the people are economically living on a minimal level of life, and where in this particular place, on the banks of the mighty river Ganges, a group of people live in a colony who suffer from the disease called leprosy. You know, where the whole body gets eaten away and the people have just stumps for hands or feet. And an inability, one would think, to be sensitive to suffering or pain, because the physical sensitivity is gone. Sensitivity to others' pain and suffering is also dulled. Anyway, in this colony in Rishikesh, there are two things that I wanted to, that brought home the source of courage to me. And one was very simple. It could be anywhere in the world. You might have seen it anywhere yourself. There's a road that goes through this colony, which is just a sort of mud track. And during most of the year, the ground is baked hard. It's rocky and difficult and hard. And yet, one morning, going up this pathway, I saw a tiny blade of grass, weak like this one is, fragile, pushing its way up through the hard earth. Nobody had watered it, nobody had softened the ground, nobody had planted it. And one stood and looked at this tiny blade of grass, alone, pushing its way up through this hard earth. Endurance, risk. It's life. If we want to know where endurance and risk, courage come from, it's a quality of life. Life, and as we see it in nature around us all the time, shows us that where there is life, there is automatically the possibility for courage, for endurance, for determination, for passion to break through even the hardest situation, the most unfavorable circumstances, neglect, to manage with the minimum for survival. So when we are awake to the value of our lives, then we wake up to the capacity we have for both endurance and risk-taking. It was in the same area that I had an example, an experience of what happens to us as human beings when we have had sufficient courage to endure and to risk. What is the basic effect? Sitting by the roadside of this place, a whole line of people suffering from this disease we call leprosy. This disease that eats away the flesh, and one would say the life of the other person. And one day, walking in that direction myself, I got caught up with a crowd of people who, on pilgrimage, were pushing to get through across the bridge of the river, over the river, to the other side, where the lepers were calling out for food, for alms to be thrown to them. And in the middle of this, a young man, with his obviously new bride, all dressed in bright red, of course, sitting on the back of a motorcycle, came pushing his way through the crowd and scattering people, the poor people, the pilgrims on foot, scattering them to the right and left as he did so, including me and including one of the lepers. As everybody shouted at this arrogant young man with his motorcycle, one of the lepers, who'd had the meagre alms that he had been thrown by the pilgrimage, scattered on the ground in front of him, was not one who shouted at the young man on the bicycle. He looked round and he called out to the people, "Look, Ma," one of the older women at the other side of the road who'd been pushed onto the ground by the crowd. He said, "Look at her, she needs help, she needs help." It is an amazing thing to have happened for most of us. The courage and the endurance that man had had to live with his disease, to go on living in hope, had brought him to a point of realizing somehow his life was worthwhile. And it's when we realize how valuable my life is that what bursts open in us, like a blade of grass forcing its way through the hard earth, the desire to protect it, preserve it. Even though it's not my life, it's the other's life, it is life. So, coming awake to life, because life in itself is the source of all courage, the capacity to endure, the capacity to risk, that brings us into a concern, a desire, a passion to protect the life of others, life wherever we experience it.